I never thought I'd be the kind of person to chase silence into the frozen edge of the world, but grief has a way of rewriting who you are. 6 months after the funeral, I found myself alone on a ridge in the Alaskan wilderness, surrounded by mountains that wore their snow like ancient armor. The trail stretched before me, unmarked except for the whisper of wind across virgin powder, and for the first time since I lost him, I could breathe without feeling like my chest was caving in. My grandfather used to say that some sorrows are too heavy for the lowlands, that you have to climb above the noise of the world to hear what your heart is really saying. I dismissed it as the poetry of an old man who'd spent too many years in these mountains. But now, with nothing but white silence pressing against my ears, I understood. The cold bit through my layers, sharp and clean, washing away everything that felt complicated about the life I'd left behind at the trailhead. Every step crunched beneath my boots with a finality that felt almost ceremonial, as if I was walking not just through snow but through some threshold I couldn't quite name. The sky hung low and grey, pregnant with the promise of more weather, and the spruce trees stood like silent witnesses draped in frost. I was alone out here, or at least I thought I was, seeking nothing more than the kind of emptiness that might fill the hollow space inside me. But the wilderness, I would soon learn, is never truly empty. It only appears that way to those who haven't yet learned to see what watches from the spaces between the trees. And something, I would discover, had been watching long before I arrived. The silence up here isn't like any quiet you've experienced in the world below. It's not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older, something that existed before humans learned to make noise and will persist long after we're gone. I could hear my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears, the rasp of my breath crystallizing in the air before my face, the distant groan of ice settling somewhere deep in the valley. My grandfather had walked these mountains for decades, first as a young man, learning the old ways from his elders, then as a guide who brought outsiders into the wild with reverence and caution. He taught me to move through nature, not as a conqueror but as a guest, to read the language written in broken branches and animal tracks, to understand that every forest has its own rhythm if you're patient enough to listen. I'd carried his lessons with me like talismans, though I'd never needed them quite like this. The grief counselor back home had suggested journaling or group therapy, but those felt like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. This felt right, putting one foot in front of the other until exhaustion or enlightenment found me first. The mountains didn't offer comfort exactly, but they offered scale, a reminder that my pain, however vast it felt, was just one small thread in the infinite tapestry of existence. I thought that was what I'd come for, that perspective, that humbling vastness. I had no idea that the mountain had its own plans, that my grandfather's stories were about to step out of memory and into the frozen air before me. The first hour passed in that meditative rhythm that only long-distance hiking can provide, where thought dissolves into pure movement and the mind finally stops its endless circling. I'd chosen this particular trail, precisely because it led nowhere, a dead-end route that most climbers avoided this late in the season, which meant I wouldn't encounter another soul for days. The solitude felt like medicine, like permission to fall apart without witnesses, to scream into the wind or weep without explanation. My pack settled familiar against my shoulders, carrying everything I needed to survive, but nothing that could truly comfort, and I accepted that contradiction with something approaching peace. The trees thinned as I climbed higher, giving way to exposed ridges where the wind had scoured the snow into strange, sculptural formations that caught the flat light like frozen waves. Beauty like this doesn't care whether you're hurting, it simply exists, indifferent and eternal, and there's something oddly reassuring about that. I stopped to adjust my layers, to drink water that had already gone cold in my bottle, to look back down the trail at the single line of footprints that marked my ascent. That's when I saw them, the other tracks, crossing my path at an angle and disappearing into the dense timber to my right. Even from a distance, even through the gathering grey light, I could see they were wrong, impossibly wrong, and the first cold finger of unease traced its way down my spine. They were massive, each print nearly twice the length of my boot, pressed deep into the snow with a weight that spoke of something enormous moving through the forest while I'd been lost in my thoughts. The stride between them was longer than seemed natural, longer than any bear I'd ever tracked, and the shape was all wrong, too humanoid, too deliberate in its placement. I approached slowly, my rational mind already cycling through explanations, trying to fit what I was seeing into categories that made sense, but the wilderness has a way of stripping away your certainties. I knelt beside one of the prints, my gloved hand hovering over the impression without quite touching it, measuring it against my own palm, and feeling something ancient stir in my memory. My grandfather's voice echoed across the years, telling stories around a fire while my young self listened with wide eyes, tales of the mountain guardian that walked between the world of men and the world of spirits. I'd thought they were just stories, the kind every culture tells to explain the unexplainable, to give shape to the mystery that lurks at the edges of the known. But here in the snow, undeniable and fresh, was evidence of something that shouldn't exist, and the silence around me suddenly felt less empty and infinitely more occupied. The temperature seemed to drop, though my thermometer hadn't changed, and I realized with absolute clarity that I was no longer alone on this mountain, that perhaps I had never been alone at all, and that the journey I thought I was on was about to become something else entirely. I stood there longer than I should have, my knees pressed into the snow, staring at those tracks as if concentration alone could force them to make sense. But they refused to comply with anything my education had taught me. The prints were fresh, maybe an hour old at most, the edges still sharp where the massive foot had compressed the powder into crystalline definition that caught what little light filtered through the overcast sky. Whatever made these wasn't dragging its feet or stumbling through the terrain like a confused animal. It was walking with purpose, with an economy of movement that spoke of intimate familiarity with this landscape. I could see where it had paused, where the prints deepened slightly, as if the creature had stopped to listen or perhaps to watch, and the thought that it might have been observing me sent a shiver through my body that had nothing to do with the cold. My scientific mind, trained in biology and wilderness management, kept trying to catalogue what I was seeing, kept reaching for explanations involving bears standing upright or moose tracks distorted by melting and refreezing. But those rationalizations crumbled against the evidence before me. This was something else, something that moved with intelligence and intention. And as I followed the track line with my eyes into the darkening timber, I felt the certainty of being on the threshold of a mystery my grandfather had spent his whole life protecting. The tracks didn't wander, they traveled, and they were heading deeper into the territory he'd always called sacred. The places he'd warned me were not for casual exploration. I thought of his weathered hands drawing symbols in the dirt, his low voice speaking in the old language about the guardian who walked between worlds. And for the first time in my rational adult life, I felt the ground of my skepticism begin to shift beneath me. The wind had died completely, which should have been a relief from the constant battering I'd endured on the exposed ridge, but instead the stillness felt oppressive, unnatural, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. No birds called from the branches, no small creatures rustled through the underbrush, and even the usual creaking of trees in the cold had fallen silent, leaving only the thunderous sound of my own pulse in my ears. I stood slowly, my legs stiff from kneeling, and scanned the tree line, where the tracks disappeared into shadow, searching for any hint of movement, any confirmation that what made these prints was still nearby. The temperature seemed to be dropping by the minute, far faster than weather patterns could account for, and I watched my breath form thick clouds that hung motionless in the air rather than dispersing as they should. My grandfather had described this phenomenon, this sudden cold that accompanied the guardian's presence, a chill that came not from the air, but from the crossing of boundaries between the ordinary world and something older. I dismissed it. As metaphor, as the poetic way elders described natural weather patterns they didn't have scientific language for, but standing here in this impossible stillness, I understood it was description, not poetry, a warning passed down through generations about what happened when you encountered something that existed outside the normal rules. My hand moved instinctively to the camera hanging against my chest, the expensive equipment I'd brought to document the landscape and my journey through grief, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to record whatever was about to happen. It wasn't logic that guided me, but something deeper, some ancestral instinct that knew I was standing at the edge of a moment that would define everything that came after, that this was why I'd really come to the mountain, though I hadn't known it until now. With trembling fingers, I powered on the camera, the small electronic beep seeming obscenely loud in the cathedral silence of the forest, and raised the viewfinder to my eye, letting the lens become a barrier between me and whatever waited in those shadows. Through the frame, the world looked different, sharper somehow, as if the act of recording gave me permission to truly see what my rational mind wanted to deny, and I slowly panned across the tree line where the tracks vanished. The spruce stood in their ancient formations, branches heavy with snow and frost, creating layers of shadow and light that played tricks on perception, and for several heartbeats I saw nothing but forest being forest, indifferent and eternal. Then, in my peripheral vision, just at the edge of the frame, something moved, not with the jerky randomness of branches in wind, but with deliberate, measured grace. And I felt every muscle in my body go rigid with a primal fear that bypassed thought entirely. I forced myself to breathe, to keep the camera steady, to pan slowly toward the movement rather than jerking away in panic, and that's when I saw it stepping between two massive spruce trees, emerging from shadow into the grey light like a figure, materializing from mist. It was impossibly tall, easily 8 feet or more, covered in white fur that seemed to absorb and reflect the light simultaneously, giving it an almost ethereal quality that made it hard to focus on directly. But what froze me completely, what shattered every remaining wall of skepticism I'd constructed, was the way it moved, not like an animal, but like something thinking, something choosing each placement of its massive feet with awareness and purpose. And when it turned its head toward me, toward the camera, I saw intelligence looking back. The moments stretched and compressed simultaneously, time losing all meaning as we regarded each other across the space between worlds, and I understood with absolute clarity that this was not a random encounter, but something my grandfather had somehow known would happen. Those eyes, darker than the shadows they'd emerged from, held something I can only describe as recognition, as if the creature knew exactly who I was and why I'd come to this mountain, carrying my grief like an offering I didn't know I was bringing. Through the camera lens, I captured maybe 10 seconds of footage as it stood there, utterly still except for the rise and fall of its massive chest, the frost forming in the air before its face with each breath, the slight tilt of its head as it studied me with what felt disturbingly like compassion. My hands were shaking so hard I knew the footage would be unstable, but I couldn't stop recording, couldn't lower the camera, because some part of me understood that this moment was both validation and gift, proof that my grandfather's stories weren't folklore but eyewitness accounts, and that the mystery he'd devoted his life to, protecting, was real and standing before me. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned with a grace that defied its size and stepped back into the shadows, moving between the trees with such fluid silence that it seemed less like walking and more like dissolving, returning to whatever realm it had emerged from. I kept filming the Empty space where it had stood for another minute, maybe longer, afraid to lower the camera because doing so would make the moment finite, would force me to confront what I'd just witnessed and what it meant for everything I thought I understood about the world, about my grandfather's life, about the nature of mystery itself. I remained frozen in a place long after the creature had vanished, the camera still pressed to my face like a shield I was afraid to lower, my breath coming in shallow gasps that created small clouds of vapor in the impossible cold. My grandfather's voice echoed through my memory with a clarity that felt like he was standing beside me, speaking the words he'd repeated so many times during those long winter evenings when I was a child. Curled beside the fire while he carved figures from birchwood and told stories I'd thought were meant only to entertain. He'd called it the Mountain Guardian, speaking in a mixture of English and the old language, describing a being that walked the boundary between the world we see and the world we feel, a protector of the sacred places that existed long before our maps and trails carved up the wilderness into something we pretended to understand. I'd loved those stories with the uncomplicated belief of childhood. But as I grew older, and my education taught me to value evidence over narrative, to trust science over tradition, I gently relegated his accounts to the category of beautiful mythology, cultural storytelling that held metaphorical rather than literal truth. Standing here now, my legs trembling from more than just the cold, I felt the weight of that dismissal like a stone in my chest, understanding too late that my grandfather hadn't been teaching me folklore but preparing me, passing down knowledge that his grandfather had given him, an unbroken chain of witness and wisdom I'd almost let snap through my arrogance. He described the white fur, the impossible height, the eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you, and the way the Guardian appeared only to those who came to the mountain carrying something that needed to be transformed, some burden that required the witness of something ancient to release. The stories hadn't been abstract lessons about respecting nature or honoring tradition, though they contained those elements like a river contains water. My grandfather had been describing actual encounters, real moments when the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for the Guardian to step through, and he'd been trying to tell me that these moments were gifts, not accidents, offered to those whose grief or confusion or seeking had brought them to the threshold where transformation becomes possible. He told me about his own father's encounter, about how the old man had climbed into these same mountains after losing his wife to sickness, how he'd walked for 3 days without eating or sleeping until he was more spirit than flesh, and how the Guardian had appeared to him at dawn, standing in a clearing where the light came through the trees in columns that looked like the supporting beams of a great hall. His father had known somehow that he was being shown something about the architecture of existence itself, about how grief was not an ending, but a doorway. And when the Guardian had finally turned and walked back into the forest, the old man had descended the mountain carrying a piece he kept for the rest of his long life. My grandfather had spoken of other encounters too, fragments of family history and tribal memory, always emphasizing that the Guardian appeared not to frighten, but to witness, to acknowledge, to confirm that the pain we carry is real and seen and part of something larger than our individual suffering. I'd nodded along to these stories with the patronizing patience of someone who thinks they're humoring an elder's romantic view of the past, never imagining that I would one day stand exactly where those ancestors had stood, seeing exactly what they had seen, understanding finally that the story I was living had been written long before I was born. My grandfather had made me promise something during our last conversation, just weeks before the stroke that took him suddenly and left me reeling with all the things I'd never said, never asked, never acknowledged. We'd been sitting on his porch as the autumn light turned the valley gold, and he'd taken my hand in his weathered grip and told me that if I ever found myself lost in grief, If the weight of his passing became too heavy to carry alone, I should go to the mountain, to the old trails he'd walked his entire life, and I should go with an open heart rather than a skeptical mind. At the time, I'd thought he was speaking metaphorically, suggesting that nature and solitude would help me process loss, offering the kind of gentle wisdom elders dispense when they sense their time growing short. But now, standing in this supernatural stillness with the image of the guardian burned into my vision, I understood he'd been giving me directions, not comfort, telling me exactly where to go and how to prepare myself for an encounter he somehow knew I would need. He'd been entrusting me with the same knowledge that had been entrusted to him, initiating me into a lineage of witnesses and guardians of mystery, and I'd been too wrapped up in my modern certainty to hear what he was really saying. The realization brought tears that froze on my cheeks almost instantly, grief and gratitude mixing into something I had no name for, and I finally lowered the camera, letting the weight of it hang against my chest like a talisman. The forest remained silent around me, but the quality of the silence had changed, had shifted from oppressive to expectant, as if the land itself was waiting to see what I would do with this moment, how I would carry this encounter forward into the rest of my life. I thought of my grandfather's hands, strong despite his age, drawing protective symbols in the dirt to teach me about boundaries and respect, about the difference between seeking knowledge and demanding answers. And I felt something inside me begin to soften, some rigid structure of grief and regret starting to transform into something more fluid, more bearable. The guardian hadn't spoken, hadn't needed to, because its presence alone had delivered the message my grandfather had tried to give me, the truth that some mysteries exist, not to be solved, but to remind us that the world is larger, stranger, and more sacred than our categories and calculations can contain. I stood there breathing in the frozen air, feeling the cold reach deep into my lungs, and for the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt something other than the crushing absence, felt instead a strange sense of continuity, of being part of a story that extended backward and forward beyond the boundaries of my individual life. I became aware of the shift before I could name it. The way the air itself seemed to thicken and draw closer, pressing against my exposed skin with a presence that felt almost tangible, almost intentional. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that I could track its descent through my body, first as a prickling sensation across my face, then as a tightness in my chest as each breath became visible, substantial, hanging in the air like physical evidence of my presence in this sacred space. The forest sounds that had accompanied my climb, the distant calls of ravens, and the occasional crack of ice-burdened branches ceased with such abrupt totality that the silence felt aggressive, a deliberate erasure of the ordinary world's background music. I stopped mid-step, one boot hovering above the packed snow of the trail, every instinct screaming that I was no longer alone, that something vast and aware had turned its attention toward me with the focused intensity of a searchlight finding its target in darkness. The sensation of being watched crawled up my spine with delicate precision, each vertebra registering the feeling separately, distinctly, until my entire back felt exposed despite the layers of technical fabric and insulation I wore against the winter cold. This wasn't the paranoid hypervigilance of isolation, or the tricks an exhausted mind plays after hours of solitary travel. This was recognition, my body understanding something my rational mind still struggled to accept, responding to a presence my grandfather would have identified immediately and honored without hesitation. My hands moved almost without conscious direction, fumbling for the camera, secured in the inner pocket of my jacket, where I'd kept it protected. From the cold, my fingers clumsy with their heavy gloves as they worked the zipper and drew the device out into the frozen air. I'd brought it as documentation of the journey, planning to capture landscapes and light, evidence of my pilgrimage into solitude, never imagining I might need it to record something that existed at the very edge of Incredibility. The camera felt different in my hands now, heavier somehow, transformed from a tool of casual recording into something more like a shield or a witness, a third party that could confirm or deny what my senses were reporting with increasing urgency. I raised it slowly, peering through the viewfinder, using the frame to both focus my attention and create a small barrier between myself and whatever was approaching, a psychological buffer that made the moment slightly more bearable. Through the lens, the forest looked different, the spaces between the trees deeper and more dimensional, shadows pooling in ways that suggested form and intention rather than simple absence of light. The quality of the air had become visible somehow. Tiny particles of ice suspended in perfect stillness, catching what little light penetrated the cloud cover and creating a veil through which I could sense, rather than see, movement. Something massive displacing the atmosphere as it drew nearer with unhurried deliberation. The presence announced itself through subtle alterations in the environment before I saw anything concrete, signs and signals my body interpreted faster than my conscious mind could process. The snow at the trail's edge trembled slightly, crystals shifting and realigning, as if responding to vibrations in the earth itself, rhythmic pulses that suggested footfalls too, controlled and measured, to belong to any animal I knew. The suspended ice particles began to swirl in gentle patterns, moved by air currents that should not have existed in this supernatural stillness, creating brief spirals and eddies that formed and dissolved like visual whispers. Through the camera's viewfinder, I tracked these disturbances with mounting anticipation and terror, my finger hovering over the record button, torn between the need to document and the deeper instinct that what I was about to witness might be too sacred for capturing, might be meant only for direct experience rather than digital reproduction. Then the trees themselves seemed to part, not physically moving, but somehow creating space where none had existed. And I saw it, the Guardian, emerging from the forest like a figure stepping through a veil, impossibly tall, covered in fur so white it seemed to generate its own luminescence. My breath caught completely, trapped somewhere between my lungs and throat, as the creature moved into fuller view with a grace that contradicted its massive size, each step deliberate and somehow gentle, aware of the ground it touched and the space it occupied. The camera continued recording because my hands had locked around it, muscle memory maintaining function, while my conscious mind struggled to process what I was seeing, to reconcile this living presence with everything I'd been taught about the boundaries between myth and reality. The Guardian's eyes found the lens, found me behind it, and in that moment of mutual recognition, I felt something shift deep in my chest. Some sealed chamber of grief cracking open and releasing emotions I'd kept compressed and controlled since my grandfather's funeral. Those eyes held intelligence and something beyond intelligence, a quality of awareness that seemed to encompass not just this moment, but all the moments that had led here, all the accumulated sorrow and seeking that had brought me to this exact point on the mountain. We existed together in that gaze for what might have been seconds or hours, time, losing its usual structure and meaning, and I understood without words that I was being seen completely, known fully, acknowledged by something that had walked these mountains since long before my people had names for the peaks and valleys. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the Guardian turned, the movement fluid despite its size, and walked back into the mist and trees, dissolving into the forest until I couldn't distinguish its form from the shadows and snow, leaving me standing alone with the camera still running and tears freezing on my face. I lowered the camera slowly, hands trembling not from cold, but from the sheer weight of what I'd just witnessed. Yet as the viewfinder left I realized the encounter was not finished, that the Guardian had not disappeared entirely, but had instead repositioned itself at the tree line's edge where shadow met substance, where the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds grew permeable and uncertain. Through my naked eye, unmediated by technology, the creature appeared different, somehow more real and less solid simultaneously, its white fur catching light that seemed to emanate from within the forest itself, rather than from the cloud-obscured sky above. It stood utterly motionless now, a living monument carved from winter and legend, and I understood with sudden clarity that it was waiting, offering me a choice. I hadn't known I needed to make, testing whether I would retreat into the comfortable safety of disbelief or step forward into the uncomfortable territory of acceptance. My grandfather's voice echoed through memory, words spoken decades ago around a fire that now felt like prophecy rather than story, explaining that the guardian appeared not to those who sought it but to those who needed to be found, to souls lost enough that only something impossible could guide them home. I realized I was holding my breath, afraid that any sound or movement might shatter this fragile moment, might send the guardian back into the realm of myth where I could dismiss it as exhaustion or altitude or grief-induced hallucination. The creature shifted slightly, a movement so minimal it might have been imagined, and I saw its head tilt in what I can only describe as recognition, as though it knew my specific pain and the particular shape of the emptiness my grandfather's death had carved into my life. My chest constricted with emotions I'd successfully avoided for months, feelings I'd climbed into these mountains specifically to escape, or at least to process in solitude, away from the well-meaning sympathy and empty platitudes that had filled the funeral and the weeks that followed. But here, confronted by this impossible witness, my carefully constructed defenses crumbled like snow, slides from a warming roof, and I felt grief rise up with physical force, pressing against my ribs and throat, demanding acknowledgement and release. The guardian remained perfectly still, yet its presence felt somehow supportive, a silent permission to feel everything I'd been denying, to collapse under the weight I'd been carrying with such determined stoicism. I wanted to call out, to ask the questions crowding my mind, to demand explanations and confirmations, but some deeper wisdom kept me silent, understanding that this encounter existed beyond language, in a space where words would only diminish and distort what was being communicated through pure presence and shared awareness. The wind returned then, gentle at first, stirring the creature's fur and creating ripples of movement across its massive form, and I saw in that moment not an animal or even a cryptid, but something that defied categorization entirely, something that belonged to the mountain itself, inseparable from the stone and snow and ancient trees. My body moved without consulting my conscious mind, taking one step forward, then another, closing the distance between myself and the guardian with a boldness that surprised me even as I enacted it, drawn forward by something stronger than fear or caution, responding to an invitation I felt rather than heard. The snow crunched beneath my boots with sounds that seemed too loud, too mundane for this otherworldly moment, each step a small act of faith that I wouldn't be rejected or harmed, that this ancient being had revealed itself for reasons that served some purpose beyond my understanding. I could see details now that the camera had failed to capture, the individual hairs of its coat moving independently in the breeze, the rise and fall of its chest with breath that proved it was flesh and blood, despite its mythic stature, the deep intelligence in eyes that held no aggression, only a kind of patient witnessing. My grandfather had described this moment, I realized, had tried to prepare me without my knowing that preparation was occurring, telling stories I'd received as entertainment or cultural preservation rather than practical instruction for an encounter I'd assumed would never happen. The guardian's gaze held mine as I approached, and I felt something pass between us, some wordless acknowledgement that we were both mourners in our way, both keepers of memories and traditions that the modern world dismissed as irrelevant, both believers in sacred things that couldn't be measured or commodified or explained to those who'd lost the capacity for wonder. When I stood close enough to see the frost forming on its fur, close enough that I could have reached out and touched the impossible, made tangible, the Guardian, lowered its massive head in what I recognized as a gesture of respect, of blessing, and I understood finally why I'd been chosen for this seeing, why my grief and seeking I stood frozen in that liminal space between terror and transcendence, my rational mind desperately cataloguing explanations, while my deeper self recognized the futility of such attempts, understanding that what stood before me existed beyond the reach of logic and taxonomy, beyond the comfortable categories that allowed humans to organize and diminish the mysteries of the natural world. The Guardian's eyes held mine with an intelligence that shattered every assumption I'd carried about consciousness and awareness, conveying depths of understanding that made human language seem like a recent and inadequate invention, a pale substitute for the direct knowing that flowed between us in the crystallized air. I found myself caught between two versions of reality, the one I'd inhabited my entire adult life, where science explained everything given sufficient data, and another older reality my grandfather had tried to teach me, where mystery was not a problem requiring solution, but a gift demanding reverence. My hands still clutched the camera at my side, that modern talisman of proof and documentation, yet I knew with absolute certainty that whatever the footage might show would never capture the essential truth of this moment, would reduce something profound to mere pixels and debate among people who'd already decided what was possible. The creature's breath formed clouds in the frigid air, tangible evidence of its physical existence, yet its presence carried a weight that transcended the merely biological, suggesting dimensions of being that my education had trained me to dismiss as superstition or metaphor rather than lived experience. My grandfather's death had hollowed me out in ways I'd refused to acknowledge, creating an emptiness I'd tried to fill with activity and distraction, and these solitary expeditions into wilderness, seeking in nature what I could no longer find among people, who'd forgotten how to speak the language of sacred things. He'd been the last connection to traditions older than nations, to ways of knowing that predated written history, and with his passing, I'd felt unmoored from something essential, cut loose from roots I hadn't realized sustained me until they were severed. Now, standing before this impossible Guardian, I understood that his stories hadn't been entertainment for a restless child, but a form of inheritance, knowledge passed through generations precisely for moments like this, when the modern world's certainties collapsed and older truths reasserted themselves with undeniable force. The grief I'd been carrying transformed in the Guardian's presence, shifting from a weight that crushed to something more like ballast, necessary substance that could anchor rather than drown if I learned to carry it differently. I thought of all the times my grandfather had tried to explain that the world was larger than what could be measured, that respect and relationship mattered more than dominion and discovery, teachings I'd nodded at politely while pursuing degrees and careers built on entirely opposite foundations. The Guardian seemed to embody everything he'd tried to convey, standing as living proof that wisdom traditions weren't quaint relics, but accurate maps of territories academia refused to acknowledge existed. The creature made no sound, yet I felt communication happening at frequencies beyond hearing, information passing through the space between us like temperature or magnetic pull, impossible to deny, despite being impossible to record or reproduce. I realized I was no longer cold despite the plummeting temperature, no longer afraid despite facing something that should have triggered every survival instinct, instead feeling oddly held, witnessed in my entirety by a presence that saw not just my physical form, but the architecture of my grief and doubt and desperate seeking. My scientific training insisted this was projection, anthropomorphization, my mind imposing meaning on random animal behavior. Yet that training suddenly seemed like the real delusion, a protective story told by a culture terrified of genuine mystery, desperate to reduce everything to mechanisms and material causes. The Guardian's mere existence invalidated entire libraries of certainty, suggesting that consensus reality was not objective truth, but collective. Agreement to see only what could be safely managed and controlled. I thought of my grandfather's stories about the mountain guardian appearing at threshold moments, to people standing between worlds, between who they'd been and who they needed to become. And I understood with devastating clarity that I was such a person, that my climbing these mountains alone in winter was not adventure but flight, running from grief into geographical isolation rather than facing the transformation loss demanded. The Guardian's gaze never wavered, patient as stone, ancient as the peaks surrounding us. And in that steady witnessing I felt something break open inside me, some frozen place where I'd stored not just grief for my grandfather, but every loss and disappointment I'd never properly mourned, every moment I'd chosen cynicism over wonder, safety over truth. Tears came then, freezing on my cheeks almost instantly, my body finally releasing what my mind had refused to process, and still the creature stood watch, honoring my breaking apart with a dignity that made the vulnerability sacred rather than shameful. I understood suddenly why my grandfather had never tried to prove these beings existed, never taken photographs or gathered evidence, recognizing that some truths lost their power when dragged into the harsh light of public scrutiny. That mystery preserved through respect served souls better than mystery destroyed through exposure. The Guardian was showing me not just itself, but a way of being I'd abandoned, a path my grandfather had walked until his final breath, where the invisible held equal weight with the visible, where legends were lived realities rather than primitive mistakes corrected by modernity's superior knowing. I felt myself standing at a crossroads, understanding that I could return to the world below and dismiss this as hallucination, or I could accept what my senses and soul insisted was real, stepping through a door my education had taught me didn't exist into a larger world my grandfather had always inhabited. The Guardian moved, then, not toward me but parallel to my position, its massive form gliding through the deep snow with an ease that defied physics and body mass, each step deliberate and ceremonial rather than merely functional. I watched, transfixed, as it approached a small clearing just off the main trail, a space I'd passed earlier without noticing anything remarkable, though now it seemed to pulse with significance, as if the Guardian's attention had revealed layers of meaning previously invisible to my untrained eyes. With movements that seemed both animal and artisan, the creature began gathering stones from beneath the snow, brushing away powder with hands that were simultaneously paws and something altogether other, possessing a dexterity that spoke of intelligence and intention beyond instinct. It placed each stone with profound care, building not randomly but according to some precise internal template, creating a pattern I recognized with a shock that drove the breath from my lungs. The arrangement taking shape in that clearing was identical to the protective symbol my grandfather had drawn countless times, had carved into wood and traced in sand, had described as older than memory, a mark used by his people and their ancestors, stretching back through centuries to mark sacred ground and invite blessing rather than intrusion. Seeing it recreated by this legendary being with stones instead of ink shattered the last defenses my rational mind had erected, proving beyond doubt that what stood before me knew not just my presence, but my lineage, my connection to traditions I'd half abandoned, my inheritance from a man whose teachings I'd honored more in sentiment than practice. The Guardian paused in its work, turning that massive head to look directly at me again. And I felt the weight of expectation in that gaze, a question being asked without words, a test whose parameters I barely understood, but whose importance resonated through every cell in my body. I realized with mounting pressure that this moment demanded something from me, that witnessing alone was insufficient, that the Guardian had created this symbol as invitation or challenge or both, waiting to see whether I possessed the courage or wisdom or whatever quality it deemed necessary to step forward into fuller participation. My grandfather's voice echoed through memory. Words he'd spoken during our last conversation before illness took his strength, telling me that the old ways weren't museum pieces to be studied, but living practices requiring embodiment. That knowledge without action was worse than ignorance, because it carried the weight of squandered opportunity. I understood suddenly that every choice I'd made since his death had been a form of hiding, seeking wilderness solitude. Not to honor his teachings, but to avoid the responsibility of carrying them forward, preferring the role of nostalgic mourner to actual inheritor of traditions that demanded more than intellectual appreciation. The stones arranged in the clearing represented a threshold I'd been approaching unknowingly through all these months of grief and wandering, and the Guardian stood as both gatekeeper and guide, offering passage but refusing to carry me through, making clear that some crossings required conscious choice and active will rather than passive drift. Terror surged through me then, not of the creature itself, but of what acceptance would mean, the life I'd built on rational foundations crumbling if I acknowledged this encounter as authentic, the comfortable certainties of my educated worldview dissolving if I admitted that beings outside scientific classification walked these mountains with purpose and awareness. I thought of colleagues who dismiss this experience as altitude sickness or stress-induced hallucination, friends who'd suggest therapy rather than transformation, a culture entirely invested in materialist explanations that left no room for genuine mystery or beings that operated according to different laws than those governing the known world. To honor what stood before me meant accepting exile from consensus reality, meant becoming the kind of person others would politely avoid or openly mock, meant sacrificing credibility in the only communities that had ever valued my contributions. Yet refusing the invitation felt like betraying my grandfather more profoundly than missing his funeral or leaving his teachings unpracticed, felt like choosing the approval of strangers over the inheritance of ancestors, felt like the final severing of roots I desperately needed, despite having pretended for years they no longer mattered. The Guardian remained utterly still, patient as mountains, giving me space to wrestle with implications while making clear through its unwavering presence that indecision itself constituted an answer, that some thresholds closed, if not crossed, when offered. I moved forward on legs that trembled with more than cold, closing the distance between myself and the stone arrangement, with steps that felt simultaneously like surrender and claiming, defeat and victory, so intertwined they became indistinguishable from each other. Kneeling beside the pattern the Guardian had created, I removed my gloves despite the dangerous cold, needing to touch the stones with bare hands, needing physical contact to seal whatever covenant this moment offered or demanded. The rocks felt impossibly warm against my frozen fingers, retaining heat they shouldn't have possessed, and as I traced the symbols' outline, I felt something shift inside me, some locked door swinging open to admit realities I'd been refusing since childhood, since the first teacher had praised my rational mind while dismissing my grandfather's stories as folklore rather than lived truth. I added one stone of my own to the arrangement, a small granite piece I'd carried in my pocket as memorial talisman, placing it at the pattern's center where my grandfather had always put the mark of intention, the point representing human choice to honor rather than exploit, relationship rather than dominion. The Guardian made a sound then, the first vocalization I'd heard, a low resonance that seemed to come not from throat but from the earth itself, acknowledgement or approval or perhaps just recognition that a choice had been made and witnessed. I looked up through tears I no longer tried to control, ready to meet those ancient eyes again, needing to know if I'd chosen correctly, if I'd understood the invitation, or merely imposed my desperate hoping onto neutral animal. behavior that meant nothing beyond biology and chance. The Guardian was gone, vanished so completely that I might have questioned whether it had ever been there at all, except for the stones arranged in my grandfather's pattern and the warmth still radiating from them, despite the killing cold surrounding this mountain clearing. In its absence, I felt simultaneously abandoned and held, as if the creature's departure wasn't rejection, but rather completion. Its purpose fulfilled by whatever transaction had occurred when I placed my memorial stone at the pattern's heart and chose to honor inheritance over comfort. The grief I'd been carrying since my grandfather's death rose up with devastating force, no longer the numb weight I'd grown accustomed to, but something raw and immediate, demanding acknowledgement rather than the careful management I'd practiced through months of climbing alone and speaking to no one about losses that seemed too vast for words. I wept then, without restraint, sobs tearing through me with the violence of a dam breaking, and strangely the tears felt not like weakness, but like cleansing, each one carrying away some fragment of the anger and guilt I'd been holding, the bitter conviction that I'd failed him by not being present when he died, by not learning everything he'd tried to teach before time ran out, and his voice went silent forever. I understood with crystalline clarity that I'd come to these mountains not seeking solitude, but punishment, choosing isolation as penance for absences that couldn't be remedied and words that would never be spoken. Yet kneeling in the snow beside this symbol, the Guardian had built specifically for me to find, I felt my grandfather's presence more vividly than at any moment since his passing, not as ghost or memory, but as living connection, his teachings and his love woven into the very fabric of this place, these traditions, these beings that walked between worlds, watching over sacred ground. The encounter had been his gift to me, I realized, arranged somehow through means I'd never comprehend, his way of reaching across the barrier of death to tell me what I most needed to hear, that I hadn't failed him, that his teachings lived on not in perfect practice, but in willingness to remain open, that the inheritance he'd left wasn't a burden of obligation, but an invitation to relationship with mysteries larger than individual grief. I saw with painful clarity how I'd been poisoning his memory by treating his wisdom as historical artifact rather than living practice. How my educated dismissals of traditional knowledge had been less about rationality and more about protecting myself from having to choose between two worlds that seemed irreconcilable. The Guardian had shattered that false division, standing before me as proof that reality contained vastly more than universities acknowledged, that my grandfather's stories weren't metaphor or folklore, but accurate descriptions of a world running parallel to the one I'd been trained to perceive as complete and total. Acceptance flooded through me then, not the resigned acceptance of unwanted circumstances, but the liberating acceptance of truth that transforms even as it demands transformation. And with it came something I hadn't felt since before my grandfather's illness. Hope, genuine and undefended, rooted not in denial of difficulty, but in recognition that I'd been given a profound gift, despite feeling unworthy of such grace. The fear that had gripped me only moments before, terror of what believing would cost, what doors it might close, what communities might reject me, seemed suddenly irrelevant compared to what I stood to lose by refusing, by walking away from this threshold moment and pretending it had never occurred. I thought of my grandfather's face when he'd spoken of the Mountain Guardian, the absolute conviction in his eyes, a certainty I'd attributed to age and cultural conditioning rather than lived experience, and shame washed through me for having diminished his testimony while claiming to honor his memory. He had known these beings, I understood now, had perhaps stood in clearings like this one receiving his own initiations into mysteries, and his stories hadn't been attempts to teach me facts, but invitations to join him in a relationship with the world that acknowledged consciousness and intention in forms science couldn't measure, Rising to my feet, I spoke aloud for the first time since the encounter, began, addressing both the vanished guardian and my grandfather's spirit, thanking them in words that felt inadequate but necessary, promising to carry forward what I'd been given not by convincing others, but by living differently, by honoring sacred ground and ancient agreements whether or not anyone else understood. The camera still hung around, my neck still recording, and I realized I'd captured something unprecedented, evidence that would revolutionize multiple fields if released, proof that would vindicate my grandfather's people and their dismissed testimonies. Yet I felt no desire whatsoever to share it publicly, understanding instinctively that some gifts weren't meant for mass consumption but for personal transformation, that the Guardian's appearance was intimate teaching rather than public spectacle. I would keep the footage as private confirmation, I decided, evidence for moments when doubt returned and rationalization attempted to explain away what I'd witnessed, but the encounter's true value wasn't in the recording but in the breaking open that had occurred within me, the death of who I'd been and the birth of who I might become. The descent from the mountain took hours, but I moved through it in a state of strange clarity, my boots finding purchase on icy slopes that should have terrified me, but instead felt almost welcoming, as though the mountain itself had shifted its disposition toward me after what had transpired in that clearing above. I replayed the encounter constantly in my mind, examining each detail with forensic attention, yet finding that analysis couldn't diminish the experience's power or reduce it to comfortable categories. The Guardian's presence, too substantial to be dismissed as hallucination, too purposeful to be random wildlife, too deeply connected to my grandfather's specific teachings to be coincidence. The rational part of my mind that had dominated for years, that had carried me through advanced degrees and peer-reviewed publications, struggled desperately to construct frameworks that might contain what I'd witnessed while preserving my existing worldview intact, suggesting rare primate species or psychological projection or elaborate hoax. Yet each explanation crumbled under the weight of what I'd actually experienced. The intelligence in those eyes, the deliberate arrangement of stones, the impossible grace of movement that defied natural law as I understood it. I realized that I'd been offered a choice in that clearing, not an explicit demand but an invitation. Continue clinging to certainty that felt increasingly hollow, or step into uncertainty that promised genuine transformation despite its terrors. Walking through the darkening forest as sunset painted the snow gold and crimson, I found myself returning again and again to the question of what the Guardian actually was, whether it existed as physical being or spiritual manifestation or something that transcended such distinctions entirely, operating according to rules my education had never equipped me to perceive. My grandfather had spoken of the mountain. Guardian not as animal or ghost, but as something between and beyond, a consciousness that moved through multiple dimensions simultaneously, protecting sacred ground by enforcing boundaries that separated those capable of respect from those driven purely by exploitation and ego. I'd always interpreted his descriptions as beautiful metaphor, indigenous wisdom translated into poetic language, because literal terminology didn't exist for spiritual concepts. But the encounter had stripped away that comfortable distance, forcing me to consider that his words had been precise and accurate all along, describing reality I'd lacked the eyes to see. The footage on my camera represented proof of nothing except my own transformation, I understood, because what appeared on screen would never capture what I'd felt in that clearing, the wordless communication that had passed between us, the sense of being recognized and judged and ultimately accepted despite my failures and doubts and arrogant dismissals of traditions older than nations. Whether the Guardian was flesh or spirit or manifestation of collective consciousness hardly mattered compared to what it had accomplished, I realized, the way it had shattered my grief's paralysis and my certainty's prison in a single encounter, leaving me cracked open and vulnerable, but somehow more whole than I'd been in months. It had served as messenger, I thought, delivering truths I'd needed to hear, but couldn't access through normal channels. My grandfather's love and forgiveness made tangible through a being that existed specifically to bridge worlds I'd been taught to keep separate. The academic in me wanted categories and classifications, needed to determine whether I'd experienced cryptozoological phenomenon, or shamanic vision, or psychological breakthrough triggered by extreme conditions and unprocessed trauma. But I recognized that hunger for labels as itself a defense mechanism, an attempt to regain control over experience that had devastated my illusions of mastery. Some encounters weren't meant to be solved, but absorbed. I understood their truth located not in explanatory frameworks, but in transformation they catalyzed. And the Guardian's greatest gift wasn't appearing but disappearing, refusing to be captured or contained or reduced to evidence that might satisfy curiosity without demanding change. By the time I reached the trailhead, full darkness had fallen, and the first stars emerged in a sky so clear it seemed almost violent in its beauty. Constellations, my grandfather had taught me, appearing exactly where he'd promised they would be, navigational aids that had guided his people for generations before satellites and GPS made celestial knowledge seem quaint and unnecessary. I wouldn't share the footage publicly. I knew with absolute certainty wouldn't betray the trust that had been extended to me in that clearing by turning sacred encounter into viral spectacle or academic controversy. Wouldn't honor my grandfather's memory by proving him right to people who'd spent lifetimes dismissing indigenous testimony as superstition and legend. The location would remain secret, the Guardian protected not through silence born of doubt, but through discretion born of respect. My inheritance from my grandfather finally accepted not as burden, but as responsibility, the duty to protect mysteries rather than expose them, to honor boundaries rather than violate them in service of curiosity that masqueraded as knowledge. I drove away from that mountain, knowing I carried two burdens now: the footage that would never see light and the knowledge that would forever separate me from the person I'd been before, both weighing differently than I'd anticipated when I'd packed my gear and headed into wilderness seeking escape rather than encounter. The camera card sat in my jacket pocket like a talisman, its data simultaneously worthless and priceless. Proof that would convince nobody yet meant everything to me, and I understood finally why my grandfather had never tried to document the stories he'd shared, why he'd relied on oral tradition and trusted only those who came to knowledge through experience rather than evidence. In the weeks that followed, I found myself protecting the secret with fierce intensity, deflecting questions about my trip with vague descriptions of solitude and scenery, letting friends and colleagues assume my improved demeanor came from simple rest and mountain air, rather than something that had fundamentally reorganized my understanding of what was possible in this world. The footage remained unwatched on that card, sealed away in a drawer. Because I discovered I didn't need to review it to remember every detail, the encounter burned into memory with clarity that never faded, more permanent than any digital file could ever be. My relationship with my grandfather's teachings transformed completely after that day, shifting from abstract appreciation to active practice. His words no longer quaint folklore, but precise instructions for navigating realities I'd finally acknowledged existed beyond my previous perception's narrow boundaries. I began learning the language he'd spoken, sitting with elders from his community who welcomed me despite my years of absence, sharing stories around fires that my education had taught me to view as primitive, but which I now recognized as sophisticated transmission of knowledge that couldn't survive translation into academic frameworks. They never asked directly about what I'd seen on the mountain, but I sensed they knew something had changed, could read in my bearing, and my questions that I'd crossed a threshold most people never approached, had been granted audience with something that chose its witnesses carefully. Through their patient teaching, I learned that the Guardian had many names across many generations, appeared in different forms to different seekers, served as threshold between ordinary consciousness and expanded awareness that most humans spent their entire lives avoiding because it demanded they release certainty and control. The grief that had driven me to that mountain didn't disappear after the encounter, but it transformed from suffocating weight into bittersweet presence, my grandfather's absence remaining painful, yet somehow less absolute, as though he'd found a way to reach across the boundary I'd been taught was impermeable and final. I understood that the Guardian had served as his messenger, carrying forgiveness I'd needed to receive and delivering permission to finally forgive myself for all the years I'd dismissed his wisdom, all the opportunities I'd wasted to learn from him while he was still alive. Some debts can never be fully repaid, I realized, but they can be honored through how we live afterward, through choices we make about what to protect and what to share, what to prove and what to preserve. My grandfather had kept the Guardian's location secret his entire life, not because he feared disbelief, but because he understood that mystery serves purposes that proof destroys, that some knowledge becomes corrupted the moment it's extracted from the context of direct experience and transformed into data for those who haven't earned the right to understand. I returned to my academic work, but found myself approaching it differently, no longer seeking to conquer uncertainty through analysis, but learning to work within ambiguity, accepting that the most important truths might be the ones that resist measurement and documentation. The footage remains hidden, the location unmarked on any map I'll ever share. My grandfather's teachings finally honored not through validation by external authorities, but through my own transformation from skeptic to guardian myself, entrusted now with protecting what was protected for me. Sometimes late at night I consider that stone arrangement, how it mirrored symbols my grandfather had drawn years before, and I understand that the Guardian knew exactly who I was before I arrived at that clearing, had perhaps been waiting generations for someone from our bloodline to finally return with eyes open enough to see. The mystery doesn't need solving, because it was never actually a mystery I've come to understand, but rather an invitation that remains open to anyone willing to approach sacred ground with humility instead of hubris, respect instead of entitlement, questions instead of certainty about answers they haven't earned. What would you do if you encountered something that shattered everything you believed about reality? Subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of the known world.